Live from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, welcome to a special edition of Balance of Power on the eve of the Republican National Convention. Thank you for joining us here tonight on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Mathieu, I'm Kailey Leinz.
We often imagine our history written in years or decades, in great movements or in long campaigns. But sometimes it's written in seconds and in inches and images.
Yesterday, during a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, bullets fired from a semi-automatic rifle grazed the ear of former President Donald Trump, killed one of the event's attendees and critically injured two others. The suspected shooter was also killed. President Biden was briefed on the investigation from the White House Situation Room earlier today before making brief remarks on its status.
We don't yet have any information about the motive of the shooter. We know who he is. I urge everyone, please, don't make assumptions about his motives or his affiliations. Let the FBI do their job and their partner agencies do their job. I'm instructed that this investigation be thorough and swift, and the investigators will have every resource they need to get this done.
The president will address the nation once again at 8 p.m. Eastern Time from the Oval Office. Now, tonight we'll be joined by politicians, analysts, and historians to help bring context to these disturbing events and to discuss what it means for markets trying to price an election unlike any we've seen before, with futures set to begin trading just an hour from now. We'll be turning to that part of the story later. But we begin with Bloomberg's Nancy Cook with us here in Milwaukee. Nancy, it's great to see you, and thank you for joining us here at the table at a moment we didn't think we would be on the air. Just a day before this Republican National Convention begins. You're our Trump whisperer. You're in touch with the campaign and with Mar-a-Lago. What do we know about his condition? Will we see him before this convention begins?
So he was, as of this morning, going to delay not going to arrive in Milwaukee until Wednesday. He is now arriving this afternoon. They have scrambled the plans. He spent the night at his golf club in Bedminster. He talked to a bunch of people this morning. He talked to some donors. He talked to Pastor Darrell Scott, who I spoke to after he talked to Trump. He said Trump is in high spirits. He said he wasn't in pain. I mean, who knows if that's really the case or not. But, he was making jokes with people. He was feeling good. He was sort of keeping it light. And I think that the campaign is very rattled by this. A number of the Trump people, two of Trump's top aides who have been with him for a long time were in Pennsylvania with him. They feel very rattled. A huge bunch of people from the campaign were in Milwaukee. They feel rattled. But they also see this as an opportunity to really sort of rise above it, portray him as a statesman who's unifying the country. And I think that they're sort of ripping up plans and reapproaching how they're going to think about the convention.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, Nancy. The very nature of this week here in Milwaukee was supposed to be very different. It was supposed to be a rah-rah celebration of effectively the coronation of Donald Trump as the nominee. There was going to be excitement around his vice presidential pick, and instead it has become about a failed assassination attempt. How is that likely to change the character of the speakers of Trump's conduct itself this week?
So I talked to a campaign official this morning, and they're not changing the lineup or who actually speaks. I think that what is up for grabs right now is sort of the tone and the substance. I think that, there was going to be a lot of bashing of President Biden and talking about, Biden's record and inflation and the economy and immigration. And I think we'll still see some of that. But I think what we're going to see much more is this idea of Trump as a resilient fighter who came through, felony convictions and 2 impeachments and now an assassination attempt. And they're really going to position him as even more of a movement figure for Republicans. But also, this is a moment where the whole country, is coming together. No one wants to see a politician get shot or anyone get shot. And I think that they are going to try to capitalize on that to really reach some new voters.
Yeah, you're seeing the bipartisan calls to condemn political violence, in addition to seeing almost everywhere that image of Donald Trump with his fist raised after the bullet grazed his ear with his ear bleeding has been making just endless circles on social media. Bloomberg's Nancy Cook, looking forward to all of your reporting here in Milwaukee. Thank you so much. Now, joining us now as we consider what these events ultimately mean for the election cycle and therefore the way markets are pricing it, I'm pleased to say Jim Bianco is joining us. He is Bianco Research founder and president. Jim, of course, we know that there are some things that you simply cannot discount, and an attempted assassination of a leading presidential candidate is one of them. When futures open in less than an hour, what do you expect we'll see?
I wouldn't be surprised if we see little changed at this point. Let's go back and look at the last 3 months, whether you want to talk about stocks, bond yields, or the dollar. If you look at those charts, can you see in those charts the conviction date of May 30th or June 27th, the date of the debate? And the answer is largely is no, that the markets didn't wobble or change directions or increase volatility around those events. Now we have another event. Will this event change the direction where those two events didn't before? If it does, it's most likely because it's maybe going to be perceived as a potential wave election. It's one thing if Trump or Biden were to win the election. It's another thing whether or not they get the House and Senate that they need to affect their policy, because we tend to forget that, a president could say, I want to lower taxes or raise taxes, but he still needs 218 members of the House and 51 members of the Senate to agree with him to do it. Otherwise, it won't happen. So I suspect that this will probably be more like June 27th and May 30th, and that this will be very little change in the market for at least in the initial hours or day or so until we think about whether there's broader implications.
All right, Jim. Well, how about we forget the Trump trade or the Biden trade, if there's such a thing here, for a moment, whether it's banks or solar stocks or whatever we're looking at. How about just the element of volatility here, uncertainty? We're hearing repeated references to black swans, uncertainty going forward. What does this mean for the VIX tomorrow?
Well, I think that, you're right, that there's always the uncertainty that it can change the outlook you got to keep in mind, does it change the outlook for profitability? Does it change the outlook for the trajectory of the economy? And the events, as disturbing as they were yesterday, for now, thankfully, the answer is no, they don't really change the direction. So I don't think the VIX is going to go up as much, or I don't think that you're going to see much of anything else. And also, you got to keep in mind, too, that late last week, if you look at things like the VIX and if you look at the rotation in the market, after Chairman Powell's testimony on Capitol Hill, we were already seeing a lot of churn in the market anyway, away from this issue. So if there is any churn in the market or an increase in the VIX, it's probably a residual of what was happening last week as opposed to what happened on Saturday.
Well, what about what has just happened thus far in 2024, considering the incredible lengths with which we've come, Jim? Are we not more vulnerable now to some kind of catalyzing event, potentially making the whole house of cards crumble? Or is there enough fundamentals that any kind of political risk or geopolitical risk, for that matter, an added layer of uncertainty won't be enough to be cataclysmically upsetting?
No, I think we definitely are. The economy has slowed. Inflation has come down. There's talk of potentially more weakness in the economy. There's an old adage from the economist in the 1970s, Rudy Dornbush from MIT, that economic expansions don't die of old age, they're murdered. And whether or not an event comes along and throws the U.S. economy into crisis remains to be seen. Thankfully, or hopefully, it was not yesterday that would have caused that. But nevertheless, it's weaker. The economy's weaker, and it is more vulnerable. So part of that, does it get thrown into crisis, also is it vulnerable for it? And I would argue that, basis where we were, say, in January versus where we are now, the economy is a little bit more vulnerable. Now, I don't happen to think we're going to see that crisis come about. I don't think we're going to see any kind of a meaningful slowdown or recession. But you're right that given the type of black swan events we've seen, and given the vulnerability of the economy, it is something that you still have to consider that could happen throughout the balance of the year.
Jim, it's great to have you with us tonight. Jim Bianco, founder and president at Bianco Research. We thank you for joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin joins us ahead of this week's RNC here in his home state. It's next on this special Balance of Power from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee with a special opportunity to join our global television and radio audiences in the wake of the shooting in Pennsylvania. Joining us now, Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Senator, it's great to see you. Thanks for having us in your home state today. This is quite a moment. Thank you. It's actually great to be here. And I think that all of us who got here safely are very appreciative of this moment. There was a text from your colleague in the Senate, J.D. Vance, a tweet, I should say. Today is not just some isolated incident, he said in reaction to the shooting. The central premise of the Biden campaign is that Donald Trump is an authoritarian fascist who must be stopped at all costs. That rhetoric led directly to President Trump's attempted assassination. Do you believe that also?
I hope it was just a one-off. There's no doubt about the fact that we are a horribly divided nation right now politically.
Yeah.
And I've been saying that's probably the greatest threat to our nation. It was what Lincoln said, that house divided against itself cannot stand. He was right. So the hope that I have is that if you think about it, we're not a naturally divided people. The major goals in life, safety, security, enough opportunity to take care of your family, those are goals we all share. Mm-hmm. So you have to ask yourself, so why are we so horribly divided? It's because you have political figures, political groups, they're purposely dividing us. I mean, I would argue that's what identity politics is all about, critical race theory. So I would like to be able to tone down the rhetoric. We have enormous challenges facing this nation, $35 trillion in debt. A dollar that you held at the start of the Biden administration is worth 83 cents. That's why people can't afford things. A lot of problems in this nation, open border, wide open border. We're going to be feeling the ramifications of that for years, if not decades to come. So but let's acknowledge that most Americans love this country. Most Americans want the best for our country, for each other, and try and focus on areas of agreement. That's, I come from the private sector. You don't get very far in the private sector arguing all the time. You'll find areas of agreement. And again, on the big goals in life, we share that agreement. By the way, proof of it is in tragedies. And we're trying to do it right now, okay, after this tragedy. But after 9/11, I mean, we came together as a nation just like that. So it's possible, but it does require political leadership. And, I'm happy to try and provide that leadership.
Well, and you do provide leadership as a statewide official for the state of Wisconsin. You are the senator. We just heard from a number of security officials in a briefing essentially saying that their plan for this convention that will be held over the course of this week essentially is unchanged. They seem pretty secure in what they had initially planned. But just given the events of the last 24 hours, would you advise them to be ramping it up a bit? Does the status quo prior to 6 p.m. on Saturday night stand this week?
First of all, they are increasing security. And there's just more personnel here. They did react to the concerns I had and RNC and other people had in terms of where the protest zones are going to be. They've moved those. They've got specific parade routes. And you see the security. You see the manpower. To me, that's the most important thing. You have to have visible law enforcement, visible manpower to deter any kind of action. Again, anybody who wants to come here to protest, do it peacefully. The goal, and on a bipartisan basis, we share this as Wisconsinites, is we want people to come here, experience this convention, leave with a really good impression of Milwaukee, of Wisconsin, of Wisconsinites. That's the goal here, and let's try and achieve it.
Well, it strikes me that there's a decision to be made here about tone, as the program is kind of thrown up in the air, speeches are rewritten. This is a former president and a candidate who has talked a lot on this campaign about retribution. And it strikes me that there's a choice between martyrdom or moderation. Which should he take?
Well, first of all, I believe those comments when he talked about retribution, he said our retribution is winning. Because he's being asked, are you going to retribute? Everything that they've accused Donald Trump, for example, foreign influence of Russia, being a danger to democracy, weaponizing the government, that's what the Biden administration has done. So take a look at the record. I don't think Donald Trump is a danger to democracy. Bill Barr came out and said the exact same thing. Take a look at what actually happens.
But politically, you could seize on this, and you could do a lot of things with this opportunity. Is this an opportunity to lower the temperature or to leverage this to win an election?
I think you see me trying to do that.
Well,
again, I've been saying this for literally 2 or 3 years now, that the fact that we're a divided nation is a real threat to this country, and it's a threat to individuals. Again, You have a 50-year-old father of, I think, two, a wonderful person, tragically died. Two other people grievously wounded because of politics. You know, again, when on most things people truly do agree. You know, we'll disagree over exactly what the solution is to, address any particular problem, but we're all trying to create a better country. We're trying to create opportunity. We're trying to create a safe environment. Let's focus on those areas.
What is the role of Congress here, both in the aftermath of analyzing how exactly what happened yesterday happened? I know that Congressman Comer, the chair of the Oversight Committee in the House, is looking to have the director of the Secret Service testify next week. Others have put forward legislation regarding security details for presidential candidates. What is the role of Congress here? What should the Senate be doing?
Well, it'll have multiple roles. I mean, the role I'm trying to play is I'm trying to turn down the temperature. Okay, I'm trying to get Americans to realize that we are in this thing together and we share those same goals. When it comes to our oversight role, we'll have to do oversight on this. I mean, we'll let the FBI, the Department of Justice, Secret Service do their investigation, but then we should be demanding full transparency. My staff has already written a letter that we'll send preservation of record letters. I mean, they have to be completely transparent, and they haven't been in the past. And so we have to do oversight on that as well. The American people need to understand exactly what happened. This was a security failure. Now, at the same time, I was unbelievably impressed with how rapidly the agents, they were on the scene reacted. I mean, they had the president covered. I didn't do a stopwatch on it, but literally a second or two.
Yeah.
I mean, that is heroism right there. I mean, in all these tragedies, we always see the best of Americans come out as well. We see the worst, but we also see the best. So I'd like to focus on the best and try and build on that.
Well, that's a great answer. We saw a lot of heroes in action yesterday, whether or not there was a security lapse here.
I mean, that father threw himself in front of his children.
It was amazing. I don't think any of us could imagine what we would do if we were in that position. Christopher Wray has repeatedly warned, and I think in 3 separate congressional testimony over the past year, about lone wolf terrorism, Senator. How big of a problem is it? How worried are you about this over the duration of the campaign?
I mean, we see that alienation in our society with social media. I mean, you see the school shootings. I mean, almost always those are individuals. They don't have very good social connections. They feel alienated from their community, from their society, and for some reason they want to obtain fame and glory by murdering other people before they murder themselves. I mean, it's a tragedy of our times. I don't know a real good solution for it. It would be nice to return to more cohesive communities, more socialization between human beings as opposed to online where things can get out of hand. You can say things on social media that you would never, ever think of telling somebody to their face. So, again, I've always said that this overall solution to our problems here, and this is a macro solution, renewed faith, stronger families, more supportive communities. Now, it's an easy thing to say, but I truly believe that.
Well, Senator, as you discuss social media, it's also worth noting in the immediate aftermath of the shooting yesterday, there was a lot of misinformation circulating on social media before facts had been confirmed. How concerned are you about that in an election year, knowing all of the uncertainty that there was about what was happening in 2020, things that were blatantly false being circulated? Is that going to happen this time around?
I'm highly concerned about deep fakes. I mean, what's the saying? A lie travels halfway around the world before the truth can put on his shoes, something like that. And it's true. So in the age of social media, these things, misinformation, false information gets spread very quickly, and it's very difficult to put that back in the bottle. I mean, the Russian collusion hoax. I mean, that was way more than just social media, but by the way, that's one of the reasons we have to do oversight in any investigation the FBI conducts on this as well. I mean, we've seen corruption within the FBI in this. So we've got serious problems facing this nation. We can't just paper those things over. We need to fix those things. And the only way you fix them is you have to first acknowledge you have a problem, do a root cause analysis, and then hopefully find people in good faith on both sides to actually address them.
All right. Well, Senator, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you being with us here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That is Senator Ron Johnson with us this evening. Now, still ahead, a look at how the RNC is ramping up security for this week's events. That's next on this special Balance of Power from the RNC on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is a special balance of power from the Republican National Convention. On Bloomberg TV and radio, I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Milwaukee. Thank you for joining us as law enforcement agencies now work in the spotlight more than ever as they prepare for the Republican National Convention that begins tomorrow. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has been reporting on the security precautions, which remain fluid today. She joins us now in front of Fiserv Forum. Tyler, what do we know?
Yeah, hey, Joe, we are right outside the doors to this arena where the Republican National Convention is expected to kick off tomorrow, largely as planned. There is a heightened sense of security here on the ground because, as you know, earlier this morning, President Biden announced that he had directed the head of the U.S. Secret Service to provide a comprehensive review of the security precautions that will be in place. And then he went on to say this about how the Secret Service is working to make sure that former President Trump is getting the protection he needs.
Mr. Trump, as a former president and nominee of the Republican Party, already receives a heightened level of security. And I've been consistent in my direction of the Secret Service to provide him with every resource, capability, and protective measure necessary to ensure his continued safety.
The Secret Service just wrapped up a briefing where they told reporters that their plans remain largely unchanged, that they've been in place for nearly 18 months, but they did add that they are adding more law enforcement personnel outside of the perimeter for this. You were just talking to Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, who said that this extra manpower will be critical to keeping this convention site safe. We also learned that the Secret Service is working with nearly 40 different law enforcement agencies that are coming from all over the country. I've been talking to some of the officers here from as far as Cleveland, Ohio. They're coming in all over the Midwest to help keep this convention site safe because, Joe and Kailey, as you know, we are expecting nearly 50,000 attendees to come to this convention site between Monday and Thursday of this week, including lawmakers, delegates, and also other supporters here to hear the Republican Party's platform this year.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting outside the Fiserv Forum. Thank you so much. Of course, all of those delegates are beginning to trickle in today. And we also know, Joe, that former President Donald Trump, after surviving that attempted assassination yesterday, is en route to Milwaukee, in fact, a few days early. We'll, of course, keep you updated when he does indeed arrive in the city. And still ahead, Jane Harman will be with us on what the impact of this weekend's assassination attempt on Trump means overseas. That's next on a special balance of power from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is a special balance of power from the Republican National Convention on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Milwaukee, and we thank you for joining us on this Sunday as world leaders and Wall Street react to the assassination attempt of Donald Trump. According to CNBC today, JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon sent this message to his staff, quote, "We are deeply saddened by the political violence and the assassination attempt on former President Trump last evening," unquote. Joining us now from New York is Bloomberg surveillance anchor Tom Keene. It's great to have you part of our production and our coverage this evening, Tom, as we consider the history at play here.
Well, the history at play is something, I just saw it on Twitter, something I was completely unaware of, which is 30 years ago, an assassination attempt against Prince Charles in Australia. We're all learning a lot here about the violence of the past. And what I think is so important, Joe, and you and I know this from our time in Massachusetts, where the Kennedy family was so evident, it's not just about assassinations. I think there's an equal effort of study of assassination attempts. And it's just shocking to see the history from Andrew Jackson in 1835 and the political violence there. And of course, the more recent times as well. Speaker Pelosi coming out just in the last hours on her husband's violence in 2022. But Joe, I want to make clear that there's a close the loop here of President Trump in his Oval Office having a portrait of Andrew Jackson beside him, the famous Earl portrait of 1835. Our first assassination attempt was a gentleman from Tennessee.
It's important to consider the history of political violence we've seen, Tom, not just in this country, but in others as well, especially given the events of just the last few years. There are things, though, that make this particular instance a bit unusual, in that it's not just a former president. It is the presumptive, still at this point, Republican nominee, also someone who within the Republican Party is seen almost differently than others who have come before, a kind of martyr. And when we consider the image that will be left in history of Donald Trump raising his fist with blood trickling down his face after being shot in the ear, do we really have a historical precedent for the kind of moment that is Donald Trump?
Well, the times have changed, as you just heard from the senator from Wisconsin. But what's interesting here is everyone is in shock, no one more than Donald Trump in this terrible event. And that's where your character comes out. And the Trump character there, and particularly is captured by the Associated Press photograph that's become iconic instantly, is this is the character of the gentleman, and this is something they have to address in the theater that we'll see in Milwaukee in the coming days.
All right, Bloomberg's Tom Keene, thank you for joining us this evening. Tom will be back with us just less than 30 minutes from now as we see futures opening in the United States. We'll see, of course, how markets react to the incredible events we have seen unfold in the last 24 hours. And joining us now with her reaction is Jane Harman. She is chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. She also is formerly the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. And Jane, it is in that capacity that I would like to ask you how this possibly could have happened.
Well, sadly, the best we can do is manage risk. We can't totally eliminate risk. I wish we could. We can minimize risk, and the Secret Service practices, as we've all been learning, this every single day. But what I think happened here was the connection between the Secret Service and the state police was not seamless. This was also true, sadly, on January 6th. And maybe it was true years ago, because I remember this as a young person in the 1963 assassination of John Kennedy, where I stayed glued to my black and white TV for days and thought the world had ended. What I see is this is a teachable moment. Not only do we have to do a full investigation of what went wrong and learn immediately, but there are things we can do. We have a gun culture in this country. And what was a 20-year-old whose background we don't really understand doing with his father's gun on a building in full sight of the former president? That makes absolutely no sense. And by the way, I don't think it makes sense to have the outside corridor of the convention center for the Republican convention include people who are carrying. I don't understand that. I think the goal should be to minimize access of anybody with guns to obviously presidents and former presidents, but to people anywhere. And so hopefully after this convention will be safe. We will tighten all of the campaign rallies around the country. Maybe they have to be indoor, but no outside corridors with guns. And maybe both candidates, some indication of this, will tone it down and do the things that are presidential in Biden's case and softer in Trump's case. Inviting Nikki Haley to his convention, which I just learned about, is one of those moves that he just made.
Jane, we talked about the potency of age with regard to Joe Biden following the presidential debate. Talk to us now about the potency of martyrdom and the decision that faces the Republican Party as it creates the messaging and revises the messaging at this political convention.
Well, I think martyrdom is a little risky if it's coupled with extremely harsh and negative rhetoric. I mean, if we go on with Crooked Joe and lock her up and all the rest of this, that kind of tarnishes the martyr's crown, you'd think. I think what was impressive was President Trump standing up, raising his hand to stand up to violence. But now let's see what he does. I mean, as I just said, we have a gun culture. Wouldn't it be great if former President Trump talked about the need for responsible gun legislation? Congress has gotten close a couple of times, but never made it. And the Second Amendment is not absolute. It's qualified with respect to militias.
He didn't just raise his hand, though, Jane. He didn't only raise his hand. He said, fight, fight, fight. Do you worry about the way that will be interpreted?
Yeah, I do worry about the way that will be interpreted. I think, he is surviving what could have been a very terrible, if possibly terminal attack. And we should all applaud the fact that he's a resilient man, and I do. And we should all deplore the fact that innocent life was lost and that people are still in terrible shape because of this gunman. But a teachable moment. What does Biden want to teach? What does Trump want to teach? I think Biden's going to tell us more about what he wants to teach tonight. He's a natural healer. This is what he does beautifully. What does Trump want to teach? If it's hot rhetoric, I don't think that's going to go along with martyr.
Well, Jane, it's remarkable that it was just this past week that President Biden was at the NATO summit in Washington with a coalition of dozens of U.S. allies who we understand were considering heavily the prospect of it not being a President Biden in 2025, but a return of a President Trump. Now those same allies are watching from across the seas as former President Trump was almost assassinated. I mean, we're talking a matter of inches here. How does the world look at this?
Well, we've had other assassinations in recent years in the world outside the U.S. Let's think Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan, just 2 years ago. And let's think the Prime Minister of Slovakia, I think earlier this year. So they're aware of this kind of thing as well. But what I think they're noticing, is that the U.S. has an opportunity, which it could squander, to pull together. And what I think they are missing is a future of U.S. leadership. They're dearly worried. I was at the NATO summit, dearly worried that a President Trump could become, as he has said he might, totally isolationist and pull out of all of our relationships with partners and allies, which would be devastating. But maybe we'll see a different Trump. But in the Biden case, I think we're going to see right now the gifts that Biden has as a natural healer and someone who wants to bring the country together. I'm not sure he can, but I hope he will try. And I hope the Democratic Party will find a way forward and pull together before too much longer, because otherwise Donald Trump will definitely win.
Well, he's speaking from the Oval tonight, Jane. This is a venue that Joe Biden has not leveraged very often. How should he use it?
He should use it the way he is hinting that he will. The talk last night and the message this morning are, I think, going to be built upon for tonight. And what he should say is, this country, what I think he should say with respect, is this is a teachable moment. Let's pull our country together. I pledge to do this. I want to work with Democrats and Republicans on toning down rhetoric, on restoring bipartisanship, and on responsible gun legislation. That would be pretty good. And then make sure that Congress spends some time at this. And it is certainly doable. Congress has gotten close a few times. But a kid, a 20-year-old kid with no particular, with an empty background and a long gun, almost killed a presidential candidate from and a former president from the Republican Party. That's got to get everybody's focus and attention. It sure has mine.
Yeah. The president will be speaking from the Oval at 8 p.m. Eastern time. You will see and hear him on Bloomberg TV and radio. Jane Harman, it's great to have you back, Jane. Former Democratic representative, now chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg. Coming up, a look at how this weekend's assassination attempt against the former president will impact the presidential race. Charlie Cook, the founder and contributor of the Cook Political Report, will join us next on a special edition of Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
Surprising. We think it will help him. I think it shows the difference between the two parties, and I think there's been enough animosity between the two, and it shows. but it seems to be more aggressive from the Democrats.
Completely shocking. I mean, there's no need for any violence anywhere. I mean, either side of the ticket, either ticket. I mean, it's horrible.
I feel pretty more compelled now than before. I was like 20-30 minutes away from here, and as soon as I heard the news, I had to get down here and be around like the like-minded supporters and see what happened.
While the initial announcement was shocking, I don't necessarily think it was a surprising event.
Reaction from voters yesterday here in Milwaukee, right after yesterday's event. Of course, the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump while he was at a rally in Pennsylvania. Welcome back to Balance of Power, a special edition here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu, and joining us this evening is Charlie Cook, founder and contributor to the Cook Political Report. Charlie, welcome back to Bloomberg. It has been an almost unbelievable 24 hours, especially considering the timing of all of this. It might seem callous to consider the political implications of an attempted assassination of a former president and current candidate, but the fact of the matter is it did happen not just in the middle of an election cycle, but on the eve of the Republican convention that begins tomorrow. So how should we think about the political ramifications of those shots firing yesterday? Did it actually improve Donald Trump's chance of winning?
Yeah, acknowledging just how tragic this is and was and how bad it could have been. But I think it's changed. Some things have changed a lot and some things haven't changed much. You think back when we talked Thursday, 72 hours ago, the spotlight, the pressure was on President Biden to step aside, and it looked like it was getting pretty insurmountable. And now the focus is not on him at all, and that it's relieved some of the pressure from within the Democratic Party for him to step away. So in that sense, it's changed a lot. But let's face it, President Biden is not any younger today than he was 3 days ago. And that the problems are still the problems. It's just that there's somewhat less chance of a resolution. That is, Democrats switching out and going with a younger candidate. That would seem a lot less likely than when we talked on Thursday.
Well, Charlie, it was remarkable to see the Elon Musks and the Bill Ackmans with snap endorsements following this yesterday. How do we extrapolate that to the voting public? How many people were moved by this the way they were?
Well, I mean, I don't know either one, but my guess is that a decision has been made and they just moved the timing up of when they announced it. But no, I don't think you're going to see a huge movement of previously undecided people necessarily going over to the Trump side. I think the real danger for Biden was going to be that Democrats were just really demoralized, unenthusiastic, and were not going to turn out in big numbers, which would obviously make things worse for him, but also make things worse for Democrats running for, House and Senate and governor and all these things. So I don't think they're going to be people that were going to vote for Biden that will now vote for Trump. And the folks that are kind of undecided, I think, frankly, most of them probably won't end up voting. But this is still, even if you say this race in terms of nationally is dead even, that translates into a big deficit for Democrats in the Electoral College, and that hasn't changed. That math hasn't changed at all.
Well, Charlie, of course, it's not just Trump and Biden running. They will run on a ticket. We just don't know who's joining Donald Trump on that ticket yet. He still has to announce that vice presidential pick. Does being reminded of anyone's mortality, especially someone who is trying to be president of the United States, potentially make for voters that VP selection more important and influential in terms of how they may cast their vote?
Well, I think it certainly makes people think a little bit more. That for what, Donald Trump has never seemed to be as old as, 3.5 years younger than Biden, because he does look, the gap looks to be different. But it does remind us that these are two older guys, and that there's a real good chance that whoever is the running mate for, either side will be president of the United States within the next 4 years. There's a good chance, a decent chance of that. So I think people will maybe watch the running mate selection, maybe even a little closer than they would, or at least a little differently. And but you know, I had thought that Trump would sort of delay. I mean, he wants Biden. Biden would be the easiest one to beat. And anything that makes it more likely that Joe Biden is going to be the Democratic nominee is something good for Trump, as opposed to sort of, you know, what's behind the curtain. So, but I think people will be looking at the running mate choice even more carefully than they would have normally.
Charlie, it's great to have you on an important day in American political history. Charlie Cook, founder contributor of the Cook Political Report. We thank you for the insights on Bloomberg. Coming up, we'll look ahead to what we can expect at the Republican National Convention this week. It starts tomorrow. And we'll have much more on a special balance of power from the RNC in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. And for our TV audience, we want to flag, we showed a graphic with the wrong date for the attack on Gabby Giffords. It took place in 2011, as on this day, we are following the aftermath from the attack on former President Donald Trump yesterday. What's being investigated as an attempted assassination at a rally in Pennsylvania on the eve of the Republican convention. That's where we're broadcasting live from here in Milwaukee. And joining us now is our political panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center of the Study of the Presidency and Congress. The four of us thought this week might look and feel very different than it does now. Rick, how is the nature, the tenor of this convention going to be changed because of the events of yesterday?
Yeah, I think we're going from a convention that was ready to sort of unload on the Democratic ticket to focus in on Kamala Harris as a potential switch out candidate at the top of the ticket, and really be kind of a attack session for the next 4 nights. Now I think we're almost in reverse, where I think Republicans are looking at really having a convention where they reach out.
Rick, we're just having a little trouble with your mic while we work on that. Jeannie, is it possible for Joe Biden to attack Donald Trump in this environment?
It's very difficult for him to do that. And I think what this event has done, it has galvanized the right and the base of the Republican Party. You look at social media, they are angry. And you look at, I think, J.D. Vance's tweet yesterday, just a couple hours after this horrific shooting. Yeah. It really encapsulates the feeling out there, which is that anger and blame on Joe Biden and his rhetoric for what happened to Donald Trump yesterday. And I think as we go to the convention tomorrow, we're going to hear more of that anger. The problem for the Trump folks is they can't just get their base. They have to reach those Nikki Haley independent moderate voters. And those people might want to tamp down on the rhetoric, not heat it up. So it's difficult on both sides, but particularly difficult for Joe Biden because, of course, Donald Trump was a victim, and we are all very grateful that he survived and is healthy today.
Well, Joe Biden is going to address the nation from the Oval Office in just over 2 hours. 8 p.m. Eastern time is when those remarks are expected. What should he say, Jeannie?
What he should say is condemning violence, expressing sympathy and empathy for the victims of this horrific incident. He should also talk about bringing the nation together. That's what he promised to do in 2020. And I think he may also use this as a moment to talk about the assault weapons ban, which he has been pushing for. So those are the things I'm waiting to hear. Of course, the other part of this is his look at the security and what happened there yesterday, because by any stretch of the imagination, this was something that should never have happened. And the government, the Secret Service, they have to take responsibility for this lapse. And he's got to guide us in that direction.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis will both be back with us in our next hour as we look ahead to Biden's remarks and, of course, assess the aftermath of the attempted assassination on Donald Trump yesterday. And again, all of this happening on the eve of the Republican convention here in Milwaukee. And we still have much to look ahead to for the remainder of this week, Joe.
That's for sure. We'll be talking over the next hour, of course, as futures open and we add more voices to this conversation, trying to get to the bottom of this in Milwaukee and what this convention will look like ahead. Stay with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to this special edition of Balance of Power, live from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on the eve of the Republican National Convention alongside Kailey Leinz. I'm Joe Mathieu as we enter our second hour of special coverage here to our TV and radio audiences around the world. Kailey, there have been many questions about the impact this may or may not have on the financial markets with S&P futures now opening this hour. We can start answering some of these questions.
Yeah, this we're referring to, of course, is yesterday's attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump at a rally in Pennsylvania. But now as futures open, it's the first chance for the market to react to this weekend's events. And back with us now with a look at that market reaction is Bloomberg's Tom Keene in New York. And Tom, at least on first tick, it seems slightly upward.
Yeah, I think Jim Bianco earlier in Balance of Power really nailed it in that the linkage here of what markets will do to this horrific event are maybe a little bit not tightly linked to some of the emotion of the moment. I've got green on the screen on the futures, a little bit of a lift here. I'm going to call it fractional. Dow Jones Industrial Average futures up 40 points is maybe an indication. But what's important here, Kailey, is it's a cross-set analysis for global Wall Street. Jamie Dimon, speaking of this horrific event, he has a trading floor at J.P. Morgan that is really looking at FX to lock in the Asia and particularly the Tokyo opening. And there again, we see a removal from the horrific events in Pennsylvania. We see some stability in foreign exchange. And I'd also point out a new bellwether from other assassination moments, assassination attempts. Kailey, we didn't have Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is up $1,000. I don't know what to do with it, but a $61,000 Bitcoin is a constructive statistic.
Fascinating. Tom, we're talking about the first 2 minutes of trading here in the futures market. Tom Keene, how does global Wall Street watch this Republican National Convention over the next 4 days?
That's a really important question, you know, Joe, that I've been doing for years, international relations and politics. And there is a linkage. I strongly feel that, but it's a linkage of confidence, not so much tick by tick, step by step, but the interior confidence in American capitalism and finance. And that'll be tested not only here, but in Chicago as well.
Tom, it's great to have you with us tonight. Bloomberg's Tom Keene with insights. We thank you. Back with us now, our political panel. Let's bring him back in. Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital. Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Thank you for being with us. Rick, you've run a Republican National Convention before. Bring us behind the scenes. The noise right now, the scenarios that they're drawing out for the next 4 days.
Well, they're flexing quite a bit right now. Tactical flexibility is the name of the game at a convention on a normal day. And here's one where now Donald Trump has changed his arrival time. That's usually a very, well choreographed event requiring lots of moving parts. Campaign convention staff are now scrambling to accommodate his interest in getting here early. I'd say the program committee people are really rewriting virtually every speech that'll be given at the convention. The tone, the substance, the videos that they're going to play, all have to accommodate the changing mood of the country and the presidential candidate, Donald Trump.
Of course, at this point, on the eve of the convention beginning, we usually would know who was going to be joining Donald Trump on that stage in a vice presidential capacity beyond the ticket with him. We asked this question of Charlie Cook of the Cook Political Report in the last hour. Does that vice presidential selection take on even more significance now in the aftermath of yesterday?
A little bit. There's two flavors of vice presidential picking. One is you want someone who can govern with you because you think you're going to win, or you want someone who can help you win because you aren't quite there yet. I would say there's been a big change in the Trump campaign attitude since the convictions that he had earlier last month. And that is, I think they think they're going to win now. And I think they're, hopeful that the pick can really represent a good governing partner for Donald Trump. They don't really need the vice presidential pick to help them electorally.
Until Saturday, we were talking about changes because of the presidential debate, what the DNC would look like. There weren't so many questions about Milwaukee. As Joe Biden has already appeared once, he's going to be in the Oval Office later today. What are Democrats doing to evolve their message in August?
Well, you know, this has been just really upended the campaign from the last time that we all spoke. And, you know, for Democrats, it puts them in a very, very difficult position. We've seen the president change his travel schedule. He canceled a very important event with the NAACP in Texas next week. Similarly, Vice President Harris, they really have a challenge because on the one hand, they want to express empathy for Donald Trump and the victims of this. And on the other hand, they politically, which is difficult to say in the moment when somebody has been victimized like this, but they don't want him to get the upper hand. And this is what this event has done politically. It has underscored the biggest message that Donald Trump was running on, which is strength. When he stood up and put his fist in the air with the blood on his face, that's an iconic moment that will forever overshadow this election. And Democrats have to figure out how to speak to that. And I think it's a very tough position for the Democrats to be in. And we'll see what President Biden is going to do tonight to try to get this narrative back if he can.
Yeah, of course, President Biden going to address the nation from the Oval Office at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzana will be staying with us throughout this hour and this week in Milwaukee as we consider what needs to change for Democrats, for Republicans, and possibly for market participants in the aftermath of this attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. And it is on that last note, now that futures have been open for roughly 6 minutes, is Michael Purvis, CEO of Tallback and Capital Advisors, joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. So, Michael, it seems initially that it is a slight upward move, but nothing substantial. And it makes me wonder to what extent the Trump factor or the Trump trade, as some have been calling it, already is priced into these markets.
Look, Kailey, I think equities are going to do what equities are going to do. I think equities this year are in a very specific position with respect to what's going on politically with Trump and Biden, what's going on, frankly, even with the Fed to a degree. I think it's really an earnings-driven rally here. To me, I think the much more important question for the markets is what's going to happen with the bond market. If we emerge with a narrative over the next week or two that Trump is by far the leader here, a decisive leader. He's going to win in November and maybe pulling a fair amount of Congress with him. That has huge implications in my mind much more for the bond market than for the equity market.
What do you make of the advance in Bitcoin here, Michael? Tom Keene pointed that out to us. It's not an element that we've had in past crises like this one.
Look, Bitcoin, we had this horrible event happen yesterday. Bitcoin's the only asset that's been trading since the event happened. So I really don't ascribe much to the fact if Bitcoin was up 10% or down 10%, I really don't ascribe anything to that. To me, what's going to be much more important is what happens when the markets get going tomorrow morning in New York. There with the major asset classes. I think Bitcoin, frankly, is a bit of a sideshow. I wouldn't try to divine too many insights as to what that is going to tell us about how equities or in bonds are going to be trading there. I do think that if Trump is going to be even more sort of presumed to be the winner in November, then I think there's a pretty good narrative that gold is going to get a bid here. There, because I think the way I size it up is that if Trump wins and wins with some support from Congress, right? Maybe not a full red sweep, but enough.
Yeah.
That you see that what you're looking at for the markets is sort of a three pillars of a stool where you have a loose fiscal, loose monetary regime combined with higher tariffs than what Biden would offer and the deportation. So that sort of three stars line up for me. The concurrence of those three pillars lines up for me for a very pro-inflationary outlook, which means gold gets a bid, and it also means that the back end of the Treasury curve sells off. Coming back to equities, this sounds trite perhaps, but I really think that equities are going to do what equities are going to do. And I don't know if there's a huge amount of daylight for the S&P 500 between a Trump victory and a Biden victory. Look, if it's a red sweep versus a blue sweep, maybe that's a different discussion. But for some sort of Trump win, but with, sort of gridlock, or Biden wins with gridlock, I think equities are going to do what equities are going to do. I really don't look at that as consequential. What's really important, though, is the bond market.
Well, it's important that you point out that a lot of this is going to take congressional buy-in to some of Trump's ideas, including the fact that he would like to make the 2017 tax cuts permanent, potentially cut taxes even further. And while you could maybe see that juicing the stock market, that also could add trillions of dollars to the deficit, Michael. So how do those things counterbalance each other?
Yeah, look, the reality is that from a how loose is fiscal policy going to be between Trump and Biden? There's not a lot of daylight. I mean, yes, the looseness comes down to different how do you make that looseness, whether it's more spending on energy transition, or whether it's through tax cuts. But basically, when you boil it all down, it's hard to see either of those candidates really pursuing let's conquer our budget deficits now type of narrative here there. And so that inherently is pro-inflationary. What's really different, though, is that right now we have a pretty loose fiscal condition with a pretty hawkish Fed. And if Powell's days are numbered in a Trump victory, because it's no secret that Trump is not a huge fan of the Fed right now, of Powell, that he's going to sort of want a more, a lower rate, more dovish regime. That's a combination of a loose fiscal with a loose monetary policy. And then you add on that the third pillar of higher tariffs, plus the potential of deportations. That's a recipe for higher inflation, and I think that has to be ultimately reflected in the yield curve.
All right, Michael Purvis, CEO of Talbot & Capital Advisors, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, still ahead, we'll take a look at the historical significance of this weekend's assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Barbara Perry, Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia Miller Center, joins us next on a special edition of Balance of Power from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is a special Balance of Power from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu, just about 24 hours after the attempted assassination on former President Donald Trump at a rally in Pennsylvania. He is now en route to here in Milwaukee, as this is the eve of the RNC. And joining us now to consider some historical context as we assess what this moment means moving forward is Barbara Perry, Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. Professor Perry, always great to have you here on Bloomberg. We haven't been in a moment like this one, seen images of the kind that we did yesterday and have seen recirculating since really 1981 and the attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan. How should we be viewing the events of the last 24 hours through the lens of history?
I'm sorry to say that it is a pattern of our history, and I had hoped that after the attempt on President Reagan, where he came this close to bleeding out and losing his life just a few months after being inaugurated in 81, that every time there was this kind of actual assassination or against a candidate or a president, and that we would try to button up the security. And just in Washington alone, where Reagan had exited the hotel where he had spoken and raised his arm to wave to the crowd, now in Washington, there's a garage at that entrance and exit to that hotel. And so as someone who started my political science life at 4 years old when my mother took me to a John F. Kennedy rally, when he was running for president in 1960. And we stood right in front of the podium. I can assure you there were no metal detectors, but I also am mature enough to remember when he was shot and killed in Dallas. And so when I was on live TV yesterday just to cover the routine of the rally, and then I suddenly heard the former president cut out, I immediately thought, I bet shots have been fired. And yet I couldn't believe it because I thought all of these security elements, of all things, someone on a building outside the secure perimeter, I can't believe that wasn't covered. And did we not learn anything from the 1963 assassination of President Kennedy by an assassin in a warehouse, in a window above his motorcade, passing underneath?
If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, we're showing you live images of the airport here in Milwaukee as we are anticipating Donald Trump's arrival here early for this Republican National Convention. He won't be speaking as the nominee until Thursday night, but coming to Milwaukee early as this convention begins tomorrow. To what extent, Barbara, are you worried about retaliation? Donald Trump said, "Fight, fight, fight," as he pumped his fists on the stage with blood streaming down his face yesterday. That is a very powerful image that Americans are seeing over and over. To what extent could this be the beginning, not the end, of this story?
That does concern me, Joe. And the reason for that is that we have to think, I'm sitting here in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the first year of the Trump presidency saw us, our town, our beautiful university town and university invaded by Nazis. And one of our townspeople killed by one of those Nazis running a car at top speed into a counter protest, but a peaceful one on the other side, and killing one of our townspeople and injuring many others. And then we know that the Trump presidency ended with the violence at the Capitol. So I am very concerned that we are in this new era of vitriol and violence, and that it could continue. And I would hope we can come back to ballots and not bullets.
Well, you referenced Charlottesville, Barbara, and of course, Joe Biden has suggested that the events in Charlottesville are one of the things that actually catalyzed his running in 2020, of course, ultimately defeating Donald Trump. And he is now the president. He is getting set to address the nation from the Oval Office at 8 p.m. Eastern time. But he's not just doing so as the president. He is doing so as a presidential candidate running against the man who just had his life threatened and was just shot in Pennsylvania. How does Biden do that? What do you expect to see from him tonight?
Well, presuming that he's on point in terms of his mental and physical capacity this evening, Joe Biden, first of all, righted that ship of state, if we can remember to 2021, just a few weeks after the insurgency of January 6th of 2021, that it was Joe Biden who righted that ship of state. And we have to remember that it was the president departing, Donald Trump, who did not follow that tradition of shaking hands with the new president and continued even yesterday before the shooting to say that the 2020 election was stolen from him. So let's both sides, let's lower that kind of rhetoric, that kind of vitriol, and anybody who's not only, I think, righted the ship of state in the case of Joe Biden, but has been through the kinds of tragedies that were almost perpetrated against Donald Trump yesterday and against one of the attendees at that rally and two who were critically wounded. He should know of anyone how to talk to the nation with empathy for Donald Trump and the victims around Donald Trump yesterday, but also empathy for our country, and then a message of unity to say, let's lower this temperature and let's not have retaliation, and let's move forward, and let's not get into an 1860, 1861 situation where we devolve into a civil war.
Barbara Perry, thank you for being with us, professor and director of presidential studies at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. Coming up on a special edition of Balance of Power, Bloomberg Opinions, Nia Malika Henderson joins with what's next for the Biden and Trump campaigns on this week of the RNC. It's straight ahead on a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is a special balance of power from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. On Bloomberg TV and radio, I'm Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz. We thank you for joining us on this Sunday as we add another voice to our conversation. In Bloomberg Opinions, Nia Malika Henderson. Nia, it's great to see you here in Milwaukee.
Great to be here with you.
I don't know what's going through your mind, but our questions remain pretty simple here after the events of yesterday, and to what extent this will alter the trajectory of this Republican National Convention when it comes to messaging. What are you hearing?
Well, listen, I think we need to have some humility, right, in the sense that we don't really know what's going to happen. Saturday was a complete surprise. They're obviously reacting to it, the Biden campaign as well as the Trump campaign. Trump will unveil his vice presidential pick tomorrow, and we'll see how that goes. I think his son is going to introduce whoever the pick is. You know, they have a new story to tell, right, about Donald Trump. It's a tragic American story in so many ways. It's a story about political violence, but it also dovetails with what Donald Trump's message has been all along, right, that he is strong, that people are coming after him. Obviously, in this sense, it was a violent coming after Donald Trump, and he survived, right? So I imagine if you think about that iconic picture, that will kind of form the overarching theme of the next couple of days we'll see here in Milwaukee.
Well, in the next couple of hours, we will hear from President Biden, who has been maintaining a theme throughout this campaign of Donald Trump being a threat to democracy. And yet yesterday, in the course of the Democratic process, holding a rally as he campaigns for president, Donald Trump himself was threatened.
Right.
How does Joe Biden make that argument now?
You know, it's going to be difficult. Listen, I think the core of that argument remains. We have seen what Donald Trump has done as he was in office, as he was leaving office, and some of his rhetoric about what he would do as president, a dictator on day one. But listen, they have a very, I think, delicate needle to thread at this point in terms of their rhetoric. Biden will be out. He's called for unity already. He had a couple of statements yesterday in reaction to this. You see Donald Trump also calling for unity, too. You know, if you think about what Biden wanted to do around this campaign is highlight January 6th, right? And tell the American people what that says about the kind of person that Donald Trump is, the kind of followers he has. That is made more difficult at this point. Someone who did, in fairness, foment political violence, right? Now the victim of political violence. So they have a task at hand. I think there'll be a resetting of their rhetoric. And obviously they're going off the air. They're canceling some appearances as well. But at some point, I think that this campaign on both sides is going to sort of retreat to both sides. And you'll have a base on one side and a base on the other, competing for energy and grassroots efforts to get folks out to vote. And then it's those folks in the middle, too, that they've got to be thinking about.
All right, Bloomberg Opinions, Nia Malika Henderson joining us here live on set in Milwaukee. Thank you so much. And still ahead, we'll take a look at how the RNC is handling security for this week's events. We'll have more with former Secret Service member Bryan next on a special balance of power from the RNC on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There's no known specific or articulated threat to the RNC or any specific individual attending. As you'd expect after the events yesterday, we've seen an uptick in social media chatter, people talking about what happened, and we as the lead for all intelligence matters related to the RNC, the FBI, we evaluate all of that.
That was Michael Hetzlett, an FBI press briefing earlier today, emphasizing that there are no specific threats to the RNC following yesterday's assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, where we are bringing you special coverage live from Milwaukee ahead of the RNC, but in the aftermath of yesterday's events. And joining us now with more on them, Bryan Gant, assistant professor of cybersecurity at Maryville University and former member of the Secret Service. Bryan, thank you so much for being here. Of course, there is an investigation ongoing into what exactly happened yesterday, how it could have happened. But knowing that the former president, about to be Republican nominee, has to be here in Milwaukee this week, we'll have to continue over the course of this campaign through November. How should the protocol be changed?
You know, Kailey, I think at this point, I don't know if the protocol can necessarily be changed. You obviously will see a heightened level of security. And oftentimes, with heightened levels of security, it brings about inconvenience. right? And so you have all of the delegates and individuals within the RNC heading to Milwaukee. But I think at this point in time, with such a tragic incident that happened yesterday, I believe those levels of security might be warranted, obviously, and they might be more accepted from those who normally would consider them an inconvenience.
Bryan, surely the investigation will continue in Pennsylvania, but the Secret Service is also now looking beyond Butler. The concerns about retaliation, retribution, or other lone wolves out there who could be emboldened by what happened yesterday. How does the agency handle this wider part of the investigation now?
The Secret Service as a whole, and a lot of people don't realize that, is a rather small agency. I think roughly, when it was in, roughly 1,000 special agents worldwide. And so, Secret Service relies heavily on local law enforcement, state highway patrol, to actually bring about the resources needed to secure venues, as you saw yesterday. So, you're going to rely on a lot of interagency communication, partnerships, to really secure, sites like yesterday and the RNC and other debates moving forward. And I think I have a lot of faith in the preparation that's done to secure those types of events. I've done those types of events during election years with President Obama. And the amount of detail, the amount of time that is put into securing those venues is astronomical. Obviously, something like yesterday, nobody wants that to happen. But I have full faith that the agency, along with local resources, DHS resources, TSA with magnetometers and things of that nature, I have faith that they'll be able to continue to protect the former president as need be.
How much harder is the job if you're in a state like Wisconsin where open carry is legal?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily more difficult. Preparation has already been put in place to get around and to understand those types of laws and to put the proper personnel in place. Whether it's finding out the number of agents you need from across the country to come to a particular site to secure it. And again, whether it's reaching out to local police departments in that particular city or state, or even going beyond those boundaries and those jurisdictions and getting the actual personnel that you need. So I wouldn't say that it's more difficult. What you're going to see is you're just going to see a level of heightened scrutiny on the agency, and understandably so, right? But to think that the things were not put in place to carry out a flawless plan, it's just one of those situations to where it's a zero-fail assignment. And when you have a zero-fail assignment, the slightest thing can make you look bad. But that does not mean that the preparation, was not in place. It's just sometimes, things happen, especially in an open air rally. It's almost, I wouldn't say impossible to secure, but things like this are very, very difficult to manage.
All right, Bryan, we appreciate you giving us your perspective this evening. Bryan Gann, Assistant Professor of Cybersecurity at Maryville University and a former member of the Secret Service. Thank you so much. Now, we are about 35 minutes into the futures trading session in the United States. The first chance markets had to react to yesterday's events, and what we have seen is slight positivity. We're up about 0.1% on S&P 500 futures, roughly the same amount on the Dow. The NASDAQ 100 futures are right out now up by even less than 0.1%. We will, of course, keep on top of the market action for you. And still ahead, Republican Congressman Bryan Steil of Wisconsin will join us live here on set ahead of the start of tomorrow's Republican convention. This is a special balance of power from the RNC in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is a special balance of power from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. On Bloomberg TV and radio, I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz, and we thank you for joining us on this Sunday, the eve of the convention, first day of the RNC tomorrow, and we're now joined by a local Wisconsin Republican Congressman, Bryan Steil. It's nice to see you in your hometown. Thanks for joining us here at the table.
Thanks for having me, and welcome to Wisconsin.
Well, it's great to be here, Congressman. I wonder what your thoughts are coming back home for this today after what happened yesterday, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, as you try to shine a positive light on Milwaukee and Wisconsin.
A very sobering moment yesterday. I think a moment to reflect and pause in both what makes our country so great, in the tone and rhetoric that we use to address the biggest challenges that we face. We do face really significant challenges as a country, whether or not that's inflation, the U.S.-Mexico border, global challenges across the board. But maybe it's a moment of sobriety that we focus in on the policies that move our country forward. And hopefully over the course of this week, we're able to do that, to talk about those important policies. And at the same time, being a Wisconsinite myself, born and raised and lived here my whole life, an opportunity to really show off the state of Wisconsin and the city of Milwaukee.
Well, and certainly there's tens of thousands of people who are coming to Milwaukee for this week. Should your constituents have greater reason to be concerned about their own safety in the aftermath of yesterday's events?
I've spoken to a lot of law enforcement officials, in particular those charged with securing the convention here in the city of Milwaukee. I feel confident about the plan that is in place and their ability to secure it. That said, nothing is 100% secure ever. And so I think that is a moment for all of us, elected officials, media, folks that care about the country, to pause and reflect about the rhetoric that has been used over the course of this campaign and redirect ourselves into focusing on the challenges we face and the policies that can get our country back on track.
Well, that's everything, Congressman. How do you, as a lone member of the House, as a lone member of the Republican Conference, help to steer us in that direction? Because there are a lot of angry people out there. There are a lot of angry people who saw Donald Trump say, fight, fight, fight yesterday. The easy path is retribution here. How do you bring the temperature down?
I might focus less on the words used immediately after that horrific incident where people are reacting immediately. I might look more at the statement put out by President Trump, and I think statements you'll see going forward about making sure that we're unifying as a country, that we're focusing in, again, on the policies, but ultimately on the goals that we want to achieve. We all want to bring inflation down. There's two separate ideas of policies that'll do that. We all want a country that's safe. There's two separate sets of policies that'll do that. And the tone and tenor that all of us use is going to be really important over the course of the next 100+ days as we head into the November election.
Well, you just talked about policies that may keep the U.S. safe. Should we be having a conversation right now about the fact that this 20-year-old in Pennsylvania who shot Donald Trump in the ear was able to access an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and not only almost kill Donald Trump, but also killed an attendee at the rally, injured two others grievously? We are sitting in your state, in which open carry is legal. Should we be talking about the gun here, the weapon that did this?
I think we're going to have a full after-action report as to what happened at that event. I mean, there's some initial questions that I think a lot of us had as to why that building was not secured in a different manner. So I think we're going to have to step back, look at the full after-action report. I am a strong believer in the Second Amendment, and I think what we want to do is pause and reflect and analyze what went wrong, in particular in the situation in Pennsylvania.
There's going to be a hearing coming up pretty soon when we get back to Washington with the head of the Secret Service, Congressman Jim Comer, has made that clear as the chairman of the Oversight Committee. Is there a problem in this agency that Congress needs to help fix?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions on the table right now. In particular, I think it's important that everybody reflects the men and women who are on the front lines of these law enforcement agencies have done an admirably positive job in keeping the president secure, keeping candidates secure, and as well as those who work on Capitol Hill or those law enforcement officials across the country. Sometimes there are challenges in the leadership. I think it's worth looking and exploring that question. What I don't think we want to do is jump to conclusions until we've seen a full after-action report as to what went wrong at that rally in Pennsylvania.
We already have seen some legislation put forward by, I believe, two colleagues of yours on the Financial Services Committee, bipartisan, Richie Torres and Mike Lawler, authoring some legislation that effectively would provide more security to presidential candidates. How quickly could you or your colleagues act, if not on that specific bill, but some kind of legislation that could address this more immediately, considering we're 4 months out to the election?
There's an ability to move quickly if we determine that we need to. I chair the Committee on House Administration and oversee security on Capitol Hill. I've had conversations with the Sergeant at Arms, with U.S. Capitol Police as it relates to member security. There's an opportunity to move quickly. Again, I think what we want to do is allow the policy to follow the facts. And the concern here, some people may jump ahead. We want to get this right. And at the end of the day, I think the most important thing we could do is all have a little moment of self-reflection, look at the tone, the tenor, and the language that's being used during this campaign, and an opportunity here maybe to refocus us, to refocus on the policies that we need to put in place, because we are the greatest country in the world. We face serious and significant challenges, but with a crisis like this, may we be optimistic that at the end of the day, we're refocused in on what we need to do to get this back on track.
We're going to be hearing from the President of the United States. He's speaking to the nation from the Oval Office later, which is not something that we're terribly used to with Joe Biden. It's only happened a couple of times. I wonder, as a Republican, what you would like to hear the Democratic president speak to. He's obviously the president of all Americans. But when you're looking at Joe Biden from across the aisle, what should he say?
Well, again, I think it's a lot of the tone and tenor. We saw over the past 24 hours the Democratic National Committee and President Biden's campaign alter their language and their attacks
Taking
against
their ads
President
off the
Trump.
air.
And so in the city of Milwaukee, we saw, for example, the advertisements that were on city buses coming down, a moment of showing that they're changing their tone and tenor. That's important. I think more broadly, it's not only elected leaders. I think it's those, all of us, all Americans that are concerned about this country, that we have a moment to reflect and to pause and to say, what can we do to help move this country forward? It's the greatest country in the world, and we have an opportunity to really turn a corner in our political dialogue.
So when you return to Washington after you and your party attempt to do that this week, do you think any behavior will change within the House, knowing it has been marked by pretty significant division, not just between the parties, but even within your Republican Party itself?
Well, I don't think we want to sound Pollyannish. I don't offer that there aren't big disagreements as to the direction our country should go. I mean, we could look at border policy. I mean, I viscerally disagree with the policies that President Biden has put in place. But again, it's the tone and tenor about how we discuss those policy differences that I think is really important. And so yesterday provided us a moment of sobriety to recognize how fragile life is and what can go wrong in the blink of an eye. Whether or not we're successful in this mission, time will tell. But I can offer you that I'm committed into trying to bring down the temperature and the tone that people have been using for far too long in this country.
All right, Congressman, it's great to see you here in Milwaukee, in your home state of Wisconsin. That, of course, is Republican Congressman Bryan Steil. We'll see you back in Washington. Thank you. Meantime, world leaders are reacting to this assassination attempt. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, quote, "I am appalled by the shocking scenes at President Trump's rally, and we send him and his family our best wishes." Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu saying this was an attack on America. It was an attack on democracy. It was an attack on all the democracies. Over in Asia, China's Foreign Affairs Ministry said this: President Xi Jinping has expressed his sympathies. And Japan's premier says we must stand firm against any form of violence that challenges democracy. I pray for former President Trump's speedy recovery. Now, coming up, our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, will be back with us as we look ahead to the beginning of the RNC tomorrow. That's next on this special Balance of Power live from the convention in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Special coverage to our global audiences as we bring you live pictures now of Donald Trump's jet on the ground here in Milwaukee, an early arrival for the Republican National Convention that is set to begin tomorrow. We're waiting to get a glimpse of the former president as we reassemble our panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are with us here at the table. This is an interesting moment. We're about an hour and change away from Joe Biden delivering an address to the nation. Donald Trump also in public here. Rick, what would you be doing with the former president? We've only seen him come down the stairs from that airplane following the shooting yesterday. Does he need to speak to the American people now that he's on the ground in Wisconsin?
Well, you know, he loves attention, and what politician doesn't? So I wouldn't be surprised that he doesn't try to at least appear in public, some kind of gesture, maybe a sound bite. And we do remember, too, in previous conventions, he liked to show up on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday before his big speech on Thursday. So he doesn't really adhere to any standard, any historical standard that applies to a lot of others. But look, I'm sure what's on his mind right now is the VP pick and announcing that tomorrow likely. And I think all of these guys have a different way to do it. I remember Dan Quayle showing up at the convention on Monday morning. You know, nobody had any idea who it was going to be. I don't think we've seen all the surprises out of Donald Trump yet in this campaign. I still expect something unusual to happen tomorrow.
Well, if you were to pay attention to the interviews he had done in recent days prior to yesterday, Jeannie, you would be led to believe he may not have fully made up his mind yet, even if in reality he had. Do you think it's likely that his mind could have been changed by just the experience that was yesterday and coming within literally an inch of your life being forever changed, if not ended?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I was reminded when this happened, Ronald Reagan said he had something like of a religious awakening after the horrific shooting in 1981. And he said he was going to dedicate his life to peace, which meant for him addressing the threat of a nuclear war. And you wonder the same thing with Donald Trump, because this does change people. I mean, we are all so lucky. He's so lucky that he escaped as unharmed as he did, although he was harmed. And so you do wonder how this is going to impact a person going through something like this. And, you know, the other thing is that had this never happened, all of our focus would have been on the VP pick. But given what's just happened in the last few days or few hours at this point, that has all been upended. And I think Donald Trump getting off of Trump Force One today is a much different man than he might have been, you know, just 24 hours ago if this had never happened.
Well, we're about to find out here. And of course, we're walking up on not only an Oval Office address from the president, but Joe Biden's also supposed to do a sit-down interview with Lester Holt on NBC News tomorrow. Rick, that was scheduled, as we discussed last week, to deal with the age issue. What's he supposed to talk about now?
Well, I think as expected, he's going to try to unify the nation, try to lower the temperature of all this political violence.
Should he still be doing that interview?
You know, look, I think part of what they're looking at is how do we campaign into this new cycle, considering the circumstances of the last day. And I think you see an emergence of a Rose Garden, White House, Oval Office strategy. You know, he's going to give this talk tonight. He's now moved the Lester Holt interview that was set for Monday down in the Johnson Library to the White House. So I think that they're going to try and make good use of him in the White House, sort of stationary for a while maybe the political waves settle a little bit around Donald Trump.
Well, to the point Joe was just making, Jeannie, that was supposed to be an interview about age, because prior to 6 p.m. Saturday, Eastern time, the conversation that was dominating all political thought was whether or not Joe Biden was going to continue on as the Democratic nominee. The conversation is now firmly about the Republican nominee. While this may complicate things for Joe Biden, does it actually help insulate him from that roiling within his party?
I think it does. You know, one of the, hidden positives of this for Joe Biden is the fact that he doesn't want to talk about age. He never did. He doesn't want to now. And now with Lester Holt, or, if he talks to you guys, whoever he talks to in the press, he doesn't necessarily have to address that first, which is a good thing. That said, this is a really difficult position for Joe Biden to be in, because Donald Trump was persona non grata, somebody he didn't want to talk about, somebody he told us was an existential threat, and now he has called him last night. He has, given him his well wishes. So it is a difficult thing for him to traverse, and I think Rick is right. They're going to try to do an Oval Office strategy at this point, and we have to see if that works.
We got a statement from Melania Trump, but it was conspicuous when she was missing from the list of speakers at this convention. Rick, you've run Republican national conventions. Would you be trying to get her back on the speakers list? Does she need to speak to the American people?
I don't think she needs to speak. She's not been comfortable doing that. Last thing you want to do is have somebody do something that they don't want to do. But I do think the family being around Donald Trump, her presence inside the hall, is an important symbol of unity of itself. And so I think that the orchestration of that, I remember we worked very hard in the Reagan era to those moments between Ron and Nancy as they entered the hall and, waved to one another. And so I think those are the moments. What really you remember from conventions aren't the sort of in and out of everything that's happening during the convention day, but that one special moment, whether it's between the spouses or the look between a vice president and the president on stage together for the first time. These are the things the convention managers are trying to craft right now, and rarely is it accidental.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors, will be with us through the duration as we broadcast to you live all week from Milwaukee, as we have done so tonight on this special edition of Balance of Power on what is the eve of the RNC. And as we just discussed with Rick and Jeannie, Joe, we still don't know who that vice presidential pick is going to be.
You'll want to be with us tomorrow. It's going to be a very newsy day around here for that and many other reasons. And we'll be back with you at noontime Eastern tomorrow with continued coverage from Milwaukee. And we'll be joining you later this evening to walk you through the address from Joe Biden in the Oval Office. Stay with us right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.